I did my project over skin bleaching in Ghana, with the emphasis of skin bleaching in the media.
And we'll hear more tomorrow.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, and then Lauren has a quick
A note about okay, so for Google Hangout, if we could use the microphones when we're asking questions, try as much as you can to remember to use the microphone. It's the only way that everyone else can hear the questions is if we use that microphone.
and one quick thing I'm going to have, which is great. So we'll hopefully wrap up at 5:30ish. We'll be sooner. Then there's an hour break. Quinn is not still back there. She's back there. She may try and button board you and talk to you, like she was saying before. She interviewed people throughout the weekend. And then at 5:30, at 6:30, just walking distance from here is ping pong. It's the room ceremony. But we're there from starting 6:30. Wander in the rain. Here, I say these photographs you'll see around the office about the photojournalists that we took it, and there's some pictures that are laminated. This is an art gallery, and you're just here to enjoy. So or you could also, it's a little bit quicker to go back to the posted overview. You're having the bags. Or you can just bring your bag to ping pong. And no, that may not. You don't want to use the trap.
Sorry.
But there is. We did check with ping pong, and if you want to take your bag to ping pong, they have a room where you can leave it. So there's no problem bringing back. Yeah. Yeah. It's about a 20, 30-minute walk each way. So we can talk about it, so if you want to do it, you can. Yeah. And if there's a group of you and you want to share a cab or a Uber, and you have bags.
just walked from Adams Inn and it was fantastic.
Okay.
There's lots of stuff to see. There's big, gigantic slices of pizza.
Save your food for 6:30. No jumbo slices, you can get those tonight. They're open.
They are open.
Okay. Now, before we get started, Abby, I actually want to get here so that at the end we'll have to do it. And then you can start. Well, here, I think this is one on.
Is it on?
Remember, you have to hold it very close.
Is that better?
Okay, so my name is Haney, and my project was education in Ecuador, and we were looking specifically at the education and higher education system in Ecuador specifically. But first, before I talk a little bit about my project, I would like to say thank you to the Pulitzer Center and to my mentors who guided us and helped make this experience. So anyway, to jump right in, our fellowship took us to Quito, Ecuador in January, where we studied the country's education system and specifically, like I said, the higher education system. We came up with this idea in part because there had been a really big uptick in the number of international students that had come to Elon's campus, and we wanted to see what drew those students there. And we got to thinking about how universities here in the States might be different than those abroad. And after spending some time thinking, we came up with three main questions that we wanted to explore with Quito's education system. The first one was whether the students going into the higher education system will really prepare for what they were going to experience in college and in universities. Second, were the schools themselves equipped with the necessary resources in order to teach these students properly? And finally, were the students receiving a quality education at these institutions? So we knew immediately that we would need access to schools and students and to different perspectives were fortunate enough that we found the right people to talk to because English is not very widely spoken in Ecuador. And I and Kate were both kind of intermediate, basic Spanish speakers, so that was going to be a challenge, but we were fortunate enough to find the right people to be able to talk to. So while we were there, we talked to Ryan Cody, who is an American who works with the government's newly formed accreditation system that happened in 2008. It's called SEASES, which is a really long acronym for the Spanish department. We talked to several students and the principal of La Escuela Nueva Escuela Schule, and some of his teachers. And then finally, we spoke to this wonderful person, Dr. Logan Young Garces, who is the head of ACLAS, which is the Andean Center for Latin American Studies, which is an enrichment program where exchange students come from the States and they spend a couple months and they speak entirely Spanish with the students. And it's where Spanish speaking students can come from like English. So he was really pivotal in granting access and putting us in touch with the students at the local students and principal at the local school that we went to. So for the first question, we traveled about 45 minutes outside of the city to a small rural private school that I was telling you about. And this is the student population. This is actually the elementary and lower grade students. Really wonderful people. And we got a first-hand look at what is often a sign of how prepared students are for higher education, and that is money and how wealthy the neighborhoods that they come from are. Because the differences between the rich and the poor in Ecuador and Quito in particular is very stratified, and that is often very much reflected in the school system. There are a bunch of malls and shopping centers and high-end retailers who are in Quito, but you drive 10, 15 minutes outside of there, and it's just completely different world. It's like a little farmland, cement buildings for houses and whatnot. So, like us, in the U.S., education is completely compulsory for elementary age students. So from kindergarten until about 7th grade, they must be at school. But from early on, the difference in education a child gets at a public versus private school is very stark. But it's even greater is the difference between the poor and rural schools and urban schools. So the school that we went to was elementary through high school, and it was run by Manuel and his daughters. And often the teachers who were his daughters and a couple of other local teachers, they often went without salaries. It was more charity work because they didn't have access to resources. And what we saw there, they really humbled me and made me realize how privileged our school system, or students in our school system are. When we got there were no functioning bathrooms. There was a concrete area that was their playground. It had a couple of nets to play soccer, football, there was a tin roof, and it rains a lot in Quito as it does in a lot of these South American regions. And the roof was actually brand new within a couple of years. The previous year had no roof. So it just showed us, how impoverished the area was. But we found out from talking to the principal that this is what it's like for many rural schools. Private schools in the city are usually the best conditions or best well equipped to teach because they're closer to the road. Like even public schools aren't scared as they are most times overcrowded and lack quality resources, which also often translates into students who are not very well prepared for higher. So it's really, it varies by the school. So the variance in the school quality results in a variance in preparation for students and higher learning. So when they get to these universities, they're often all into the math and physics skills and where to promote learning. But what was so special about this particular school that even though there were limited resources and funds, you could tell the children were hungry for learning and that their teachers were really inspiring and instilling the need to learn and to better themselves. So they had little, but they were making a big difference with it. So the answer to the second and third questions are kind of wrapped together. And those questions were whether they were well equipped with the necessary resources and whether the students in the university system need some quality education. And those go back to the 2008 constitutional reform. In 2008, President Correa brought sweeping changes to the education system and installed a new grading system for every university in Ecuador. It required students to take for the first time ever an entrance exam, which dictated what and where you were going to study in Ecuador. And it really emphasized STEM and technical fields above liberal arts education. So science and technology and math classes were really emphasized. So this was really significant because it was the first time education had been written into the Constitution. It was the first time that really there was an insurance for quality in the university system. So, in talking to Ryan Kirby, who works with Synopsis, we found that anyone used to be could just walk into the university and take a degree without taking the classes, without proving that you have knowledge and skills to be able to qualify for the learn. So now the ranking system that determines what a school's grade is based on qualitative and quantitative standards. So that any school that isn't making the grade is put on probation and they are shut down until they complete that they are qualified. So that was one drastic change. And to be sure, these reforms are trying to improve the system. But Dr. Fernando Mendoza is really skeptical. He says the prove themselves to really know whether they are making a difference. It was really critical, in particular, about the entrance exam, which kind of takes away the students' right to choose. And I know, as just graduating myself, I couldn't imagine somebody, especially the government, telling them you have to go to school and study this field. So it really was quite a big difference in what we used. So, but one good thing he said about the education reforms, and Ryan also voiced this, is that there's a rising idea of the culture of quality. And the rising middle class, we see in downtown, the skyscrapers, even KFCs and globalization. But he said that there's an idea now that it is good to want to be able to learn just for the sake of learning. That education matters and the quality of education matters. And while all of this is good, we hope that the change will eventually lead to improvement in the education system in Ecuador. But surely it will take a lot of thoughtful reform to ensure that the students like that we saw with Stewart really be integrated into the system and not
But one thing I just wanted to explain, Kate Riley was another friend of Elon, and Patty and Kate did the project together, but Kate was unable to this weekend, and she had this conversation months ago. Hi, everyone. Is it on?
It's on, if you hold it close.
Okay. I didn't see it. That's
Is there
a
a
green
green
light.
Press and hold that button. Sometimes it's a red light. everyone. I'm Jessie Lee. I'm a senior English major at Davidson College, and this summer I'm on a 2-month journey to investigate educational access for students with disabilities. And so how this project came about is I've always been really interested in educational access. I spent the previous 2 summers teaching in China and Hong Kong, teaching college students and then teaching underserved middle school students in Hong Kong. And so that's how this project came about. And one of the things that made me interested in it is, a lot of people laud China for having highest test scores, and these children are super gifted, everyone is saying. But what about the other side of education in China? What about special education? And so that's what I was looking into. One of the things is, while China is doing really well in test scores, in terms of special education, they're not doing so well. 40% of children with disabilities are illiterate in China, and anywhere between 25 and 50% of children with disabilities don't have the opportunity to go to school in China. And so that's a really big problem. In 2008, China ratified the Convention for the Rights of Children with Disabilities. And so this was the first step towards full inclusion. But the big problem is that there's a lot of social stigma, and that social stigma actually drives a lot of the problems with the education system. For a long time, disabled people in China were referred to as handicapped, which really literally means handicapped obstacle. And this kind of thinking still prevails in a lot of aspects. So yeah, I went to Nagy for a month and Walsh for a month, and because of this presentation, I get focused on my time in Walsh. And so this image is from a special education school there. So basically, what I focused on was entering the special education system. And how it works in China is there are special schools where they put all the students with disabilities. The problem is that they are mainly in cities, and there's not a lot of access for students in rural areas. And so that's why a lot of students don't have access to these schools. One of the problems is that a lot of parents are unwilling to admit that their child has a disability, or unwilling to face the reality. So at some schools, I went to regular schools and special education schools. At some regular schools, there would be teachers saying, well, this student definitely has autism, but the parent won't take the steps to bring the student to a special education school, so we have no way of educating the student. And then even within the special education schools, a lot of the curriculum is really behind, and a lot of the teachers are really struggle with how exactly to help the students. The teachers don't really get a lot of special education training. Only a very small percentage of those teachers have gone to special education schools where they experience this kind of training. So it's a problem on a lot of angles. In this image, this is going by special education school in Guangzhou. This is a student sitting in a classroom. And then in that image, it's in children who are in special education school, which is actually the biggest special education school in China. It has almost 1,000 students. And this is vocational training for training disabled students to deal with the yeah. And then this image is from the Guangzhou School for the Blind, and it's an image of the safety line. Yeah, so now I'm going to talk about deaf education in China. So one of the big things in deaf education is that it's doing the best out of all the different special educations in China. But a big problem with deaf education is the question of whether to teach students sign language or spoken language. A lot of parents are unwilling to have their children kind of stand out in using sign language. They want the teachers to teach only, reading other people's mouths and then being able to mouth words back. And so there were a lot of places I was where the principal would say, a parent will come up to me and ask, do you teach sign language? And if I say yes, they don't want to bring their child here. So that's a big problem because for deaf students, sign language
is kind of their mother language. That's how they learn to communicate. And by denying them access to that language, that's a huge obstacle in education. In this image, this is elementary school students learning Chinese, and I thought it was funny because they're learning Latin. Yeah. And then this is another image. This is from the big school that I mentioned before in Shenzhen. It's an annual student art exhibition. And so a lot of the students will learn to do arts and crafts as ways of vocational training. Now, to jump to blind education. So these images are from Guangdong School for the Blind. And on this side is a student using an abacus, and on this side is a student using a stylus and a slate for Chinese braille. And one thing I thought that was really interesting about this school is it's located right next to a massage center. So it almost implies that the ideal still prevails, the jobs, the futures for students who are blind are limited. A lot of them are assigned into these vocations, these very limited sets of vocations for which their school will bring them, and they don't have a lot of class. Which brings us to the question of higher education. So this is the image of the massage center next to the Guangdong School for the Blind. So in terms of higher education, one of the biggest problems is that it's very difficult to go to college if you have a disability. For deaf students, they have a special, a modified exam of the Chinese National College Entrance Exam. But the problem is that for every school they apply to, they have to go take a different test at that school, which is different compared to the regular students in China. And also, in terms of choosing a choice of major, deaf students can only choose between 1, computer technology or IT, and 2, arts, creative arts. And so if you're especially gifted in science or, Chinese literature, that's not really an avenue that you can take because of the limited education system. And the schools that you might be able to go to are limited as well. Most of the schools that you'd be able to go to as a deaf student would be special education colleges and not, Peking University, which is the best university, one of the best universities in China. And so just recently, this summer, the China Daily came out with an article that was about a deaf student who performed particularly high on an exam, but the college that she wanted to go to denied her on the grounds that she was not able to complete the physical fitness test because she was deaf. And so this is a big problem with the educational system, the idea that there's still the stigma surrounding disability from parents, from teachers, and from the institutions themselves. In particular, there's a lot of infrastructure for expanding these schools, but the problem is that although there's a lot of expansion in terms of building these schools and advancing the existing school systems, there's not a lot of work in changing the actual stigma surrounding it, which is obviously a really difficult problem. So in this image, on this side is student artwork. That's the top, and then here, this is deaf teachers embroidery in children with special education students. And so one of the options for students who are able to graduate from college, they can go back and teach. But even when I was after school, I asked them, how many students have come back to work as staff or teachers, and they said right now it's 3, and they're mostly administrative positions, with the exception of this one teacher. So I guess my question in terms of wrapping up this project is how can we use the existing infrastructure in China to expand access to students with disabilities in rural areas and to change the way people think about disability in China. Thank you. Actually, just so we don't forget that, this is good. Abby, why don't you go? Yep.
I'm with Nagy and I'm from University. So my project is a bit different because instead of showing me something that's wrong wrong in a country, I'm kind of using something that's really right in a country to reflect maybe what's wrong in maybe our country based on what you think in other countries.
Hold it close. Really
It
close.
is. Can you not hear me?
Is it on?
Yes, it's better.
There's no light on right? So again, I'm using this project to kind of not reflect the trauma in Norway, specifically rights in Norway, but show you or open your mind to something that may be wrong here or other places. So when I found this project and I got the idea for it, I read a lot of articles about this prison that kind of depicted it in a way of the Disney World in prison or a hotel with all these lavish things. If you Google this prison, you actually see a picture of an inmate sunbathing. So this is how our media portrays this prison, but there's so much more to it that I just want to shine light on. So really quickly, this is more presentation style, so I put a lot of words up here. I'll tell you just a little bit of general information and then look at the prison philosophy, a typical day, and then I'll give you the stats that I found really shocking. So it is a prison island. It's located right outside of the Oslo fjord. First of all, it's good to know that there's no death penalty in Norway, so that's already really different to what we're used to. And the maximum sentence is only 21 years. So again, the island is located in the Oslo fjord. It's all by itself there. It's the first and largest low security prison in Norway. There's 115 to 120 inmates, so it's pretty average to be kind of prison. There are 72 full-time staff, only 35 are guards, and there are 0 weapons on this entire island. It's designed for prisoners with longer sentences, and they have to apply for transfer, which means that these prisoners have long sentences, they're in a high security prison, and then they apply to transfer to this prison, and then after this prison, some of them can complete the rest of their sentence at home. So you're already in a step-by-step process to come back to normal life. The average sentence is 5 years, and the average time that they spend on this prison island is 1.5 years. So in this picture, there's actually a public beach on the island, and this fence that you see is the only thing separating 200 prison inmates from the public on this public beach. So the philosophy of the prison is a human ecological prison, and it's really wordy, but I'm going to break it down for you. So it means they're concerned with relationships between people and their socially and artificially created environments. It focuses on how humans function together and are influenced by each other and influenced by nature, and also how we influence nature. So these two men are the former and current prison governors, and you can just read their quotes. They're very philosophical about the ecological thing. They believe in it extremely strongly, and that's one of the biggest things for the staff that they have to believe in this process. So it's the first human ecological prison in the world, and that it got that title in 2008. I believe it still is the only human ecological prison. There's a lot of reforms being modeled off of it, but for right now it's the only one with that title. So what this means is that the prison grows and raises all its food. Everything on the island is recycled. Literally, they cannot be on the island without working to sustain it. It's a community. Everybody has to work together to survive. So this teaches the inmates to look at the bigger picture of life, what they contribute to, what they can do, and how things bad or wrong, it affects not just them, but their community. This one's slide missing, actually. Oh, no, there it is. Okay. So a typical day for an inmate, there is no typical day for an inmate, so I just wanted to show you that because every inmate is going to have a different day because every inmate is different. And rehabilitation for every person is going to be different. So again, the prison focuses on rehabilitation over anything, rehabilitation over punishment, over lack of freedom, anything. So for some inmates, rehabilitation is going to school. Here. Okay. So for some inmates, rehabilitation means going to school, getting maybe an education that they didn't have before, or expanding their education. This is free for inmates, it's free for everyone in Norway, so they can take classes off the island at a regular university or on the island, just depending on what they work out.
For some people, rehabilitation is music. There's a blues band on the prison that has become really big. They've actually played the biggest blues festival in Europe. They got to go and play that. So they have taught themselves throughout their sentence how to make music, and they come together as a band to work together, problem solving, all those issues that go into regular life. They learn through music, which is the rehabilitation. Some people choose to work with the animals on the island. They think that being with the animals, being with nature, they don't judge you, they're very peaceful, it gives them time to think. That's just their way of coping with what they've done and getting their mind ready to go back into society, because everybody will go back into society. Some people work on the ferry. So when I was going to this island, I was on a ferry with 3 other. Okay, so when I was going to the island, I was on a ferry with 3 other inmates that were driving to the island. There were not guards with them. Again, there's no weapons. I'm just trusting these inmates to get me to the island. But it's what they do every single day. It's their job, and they're learning a skill that they can take out with them when they go back to normal society. For some people, it's religion. There's a mentor on the island that they can go and talk to about life without being judged. It's not a prison guard that's sitting there telling them what to do. They talk about what they think and they work through their issues. There are rules though, so don't get me wrong. They work if they're working from 8 to 3. They're counted 4 times a day. There are strict guidelines here with it, but I'm just kind of highlighting to you the things that they can do. So here's a quote from a man I spent a lot of time with. He is in the middle of his 18-year sentence for murder. And 18 years for murder is actually a really long sentence in Norway, which probably means that it was multiple people that it was multiple people the crime was committed against, or it was done in an abusive way or something. But he's halfway through his sentence, and he's the leader of the blues band. And I just think that this quote is really great. He says, "You learn to relate to people in a normal way. When you're in a locked prison, it's easy to go in the room and close the door," which is what we used to say here. "You can isolate yourself from the rest. Here we don't allow it. If there's a problem, we take it out, we discuss it out in the open, and we solve it. It's something you're going to bring out with you the rest of your life." So he's basically just talking about how, if he was going back into normal society straight from his high-security prison, he wouldn't be prepared to come out. In those places, nobody is handing you responsibility. They're telling you when to wake up. They're telling you when to go to work. They're telling you what to do every day. You don't have any choice to decide. So here at Buster, they give you the choice to decide. They give you responsibilities. Another thing that was really big was there's an opportunity, if you're a father, to take father classes to learn how to relate to your children again. Because your children are not victims, or your children are not dependable. They're the victim of having their father taken away because of whatever crime was committed. So they shouldn't have to suffer because their father committed the crime. So there's a house on the island that families can come to. It's full of toys, games, there's a backyard playset. So fathers learn how to be a father to their children. It is extremely important for the child when they go back into society to know how to relate to their father that was taken from them for 18 years, for instance, in Davidson's case. So, yeah, the prison just has all these issues are handled kind of. And I think in American society, we have an issue with not handling the problems that got people in prison in the first place. And the former governor actually said to me, American prisons are a place where people learn how to become more criminal. So with that, I think about it. And, yeah.
Hi, I'm Adriane Walsh. I am a grad student at University. And I did my project on health and obesity in the UK. And as Tom Henry had said before, London is pretty great. Everybody speaks English. It's like to give you some stats, I literally just got back from being there, so I'm a little disorganized. So to give you some stats on obesity, the World Health Organization said in 2008 more than 1.4 billion adults 20 and older were overweight. Of these overweight adults, 200 million men and nearly 300 million women were obese.
Overall, that's more than 10% of the world's adult population. Overweight and obesity are more deaths worldwide than people who are underweight. And Mexico just passed the US as the most obese country, and the UK is not far behind. So there was a foresight report that was conducted by the UK government in 2007 that predicted that half the UK population would be obese by 2050. And that was basically a healthcare cost of £50 billion or 81 billion US dollars per year. So they created this organization called the National Obesity Forum, and it was founded in 2000 to raise awareness on obesity in the UK. And it determined that due to upward trends in obesity levels, that those conclusions were basically optimistic and will be exceeded by 2050. So I went to London to figure out what's causing this and what is being done. I met with Harry Rutter, who is a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and he's also an advisor to the Public Health England. And I have a quote from him. He says, "Obesity is a normal response by normal people to an abnormal environment. So people are not becoming lazier or greedier. Their genetics haven't changed over the last 30 or 40 years, but the world around us has changed completely." He sees obesity basically as a result of neoliberal capitalism and as not a deliberate ploy, but basically an inevitable side effect. So he says that obesity is collateral damage to contemporary lifestyle and the kinds of things we all want: abundance, convenience, choice, and it's a brave politician who votes to constrain that. He also points out that the word obesity is very unhelpful for us to understand the problem. He says it's okay to use as a technical jargon in conversation, but that it has a lot of baggage associated with it, because really what the problem is that people are overweight, not necessarily obese. He's really more concerned with the shift in the weight distribution, and that there are fewer people at a normal healthy weight and more people on the other side of the spectrum. He pointed out in our conversation that is probably just people. I didn't observe a big lifestyle difference compared to the US in terms of convenience. People seem to seek it just like we do. I did feel like I was more active there than I had been here in a long time, because we walk a lot, we use public transportation. But I was told that London is a very special case, and that when you step outside of London, it's quite a different story. I spoke to an obesity researcher, Dr. Brody, and she told me that London is very isolated in relation to the UK, and that people are more conscious of their body, like people are less New York, people are really more conscious of their body than other parts of the country. I did witness in some lower income sections of town. There's a supermarket called Iceland, and they do not sell any fresh food. So it's basically just aisles and aisles and aisles of processed food. And it's very inexpensive and it's easily accessible. So this is what people in lower income houses are having to buy. Regular grocery stores such as Tesco and Sainsbury's, it's very much like the US, where the foods are loaded in things you can't pronounce and a lot of sugar. On the same token, I went to Borough Market, which is a very large farmers market right in the center of London, and it was pretty amazing. I'm not doing my slides. I have some pictures. And you can get tons of fresh food there. There is farmers that come from all over the country, and they sell fresh produce, fish, oils, salts, eggs, and an abundance of healthy food. I also visited one of the 5 vegan raw restaurants called Mama, where I spoke to the owner, Irene Rainbow. And she basically agreed that London isn't so bad anymore, but if you go outside of London, it's very worse. And she started this restaurant because she said as she grew up, back to the school was back to the school, and now it's school is. And it's very disturbing to her, and her mother has come down with celiac disease, which is the disease we're born with, and now has leprosy. So despite London being thought of as health conscious, finding this type of food is very difficult. I am gluten intolerant and intolerant, so for me, eating is not easy. I did find 2 Whole Foods. London is a very big city, so it just kind of interesting. And there was the one organic grocery store that was in Nottingham, which is thought to be quite accommodating. So what are the answers? I sat down with Dr. Graham McGregor, who's a professor of cardiovascular medicine at Wilson Institute of Preventive Medicine, and he basically started an organization program called Consensus Action on Salt and Health, aimed at lowering the salt intake from 9 grams a day to 6 grams a day. And this is a result of finding that salt was a major cause of high blood pressure, which was in turn responsible for 50% of cardiovascular disease cases in the World Health Organization report that said that industrial countries, more than 75% of salt intake is coming from processed foods. So basically what they did was they decided what the targeted amount of salt reduction was going to be per year, and they just took a little bit out of the food every single year, and they just didn't tell anyone. And the whole motto is, if you tell people, oh, this food has less salt in it, people are not going to buy it because they're going to think, oh, it's not going to taste good. So people didn't ask for more salt to be in their food, so they don't need to be asked for the salt to be removed. And the food companies in the UK are very cooperative because they want people to be happy with what the food is. They don't have lobbyists the way they do here, so they'll agree to something as long as the people are going to sell on their product. So it really was very successful, and what Dr. McGregor said was basically that biologically our palates change from adjusting from needing the salt to not needing the salt. So over time, if you do gradually, people don't. Well, now they're doing the same exact thing with sugar, and there's a program called Action Sugar, and basically that's where they're turning their focus to. I only have 2 minutes left, but he feels that if sugar is taken out of the food at a targeted rate per year, the same thing applies. People don't need to know. And it basically is a movement. So there's a little bit of debate in the UK about this. Professor Rutter, who I spoke to, said that he feels that that's only part of the problem. He fundamentally agrees with them, but he thinks that they're overstating it. And just to wrap up, he left me with this quote: "The problem is absolutely the same everywhere fundamentally. Everywhere in the world is facing the same set of problems, but the biggest challenge we face, I think, is that it is very poorly understood and very poorly articulated in both political and media discourse."
Great job, everyone. I have a question for Jessie. I was wondering, as you were speaking, what, if any, effects the one-child policy has on the awareness around children with disabilities. So families who maybe only have one child and have a child with disability, is there any extra push for gaining education for them?
That's a great question. I didn't really look into the comparison. Oh, okay. I didn't really look into the comparison between, one-child, or the correlation between one-child policy and children who have disabilities. But I do know that it is a problem in that since a lot of parents feel this kind of shame when they have a child with a disability, they kind of lament the fact that there is a one-child policy because they feel that their child has this, big flaw. So that's a problem. Thanks.
I thought it was fascinating topics and great research. I had a question really for everybody about the journalism strategy that you followed and how to take this research, what you're thinking is good, how to turn this into stories that might define your own journalism. And I'm just curious how you thought about it.
Well, I also did part of my project on binge drinking in the UK, which we sort of did both on today, so that's not too long. And I think that it's really interesting and relevant. And I think that I think people in the UK really want to know how to change it. And I think that there's a weird cultural tie to like alcohol within the UK. You see mothers with their babies in bars, and it's completely acceptable. And women who are pregnant can drink, and that's completely acceptable. And I think Americans would be interested to learn things like that. And as far as obesity, I think it's also relevant to our country too. So my strategy really when I went over there was just to talk to anybody who would talk to me. I went into pubs, I observed, I took pictures of this one guy who walked in with a stroller and stopped, had a pint, and kept me. And so I just kind of went in and talked to whoever would talk to me. And then as far as obesity went, nobody wants to talk about that. So even I noticed the government was really reserved about making stuff look bad. So I just talked to anybody that would talk to me. And I'm still compiling my stories. But I think that they're relevant and people would be interested to read them. I like that we're doing separate articles on different parts of information.
So in terms of how this will play out in my articles and whatnot, one thing that's really interesting about special education in China is in China and in America, really, nobody really knows about it. I was talking to a professor who specializes in preschool education, and she said that 10 years ago, if you asked someone what special education is, just on the street, they wouldn't really have any idea. She said she asked one friend one time, and she thought that it was related to some kind of science or something. And so it's just there's a lack of awareness, and so I think that people will be really interested in it. Another thing is that when I was in China, principals were constantly comparing the Chinese special education system to the one in America, and they're all saying, well, we think it's so amazing in America, or it's so amazing in Taiwan, and we want to model ourselves after that. And so I think for people reading this in the US, it will be interesting to see how it actually does compare and how they are following the models, and how in some ways they can't follow the models that exist. Yeah. And another thing is the Human Rights Watch came out with a really good report on education for people with disabilities in China. But I'm trying to focus more on specifically the system that exists in special education. So hopefully that was something.
So initially, our strategy was to try to find parents to talk to about, especially in rural Quito, the struggle of trying to provide an education for their children. And we kind of also stumbled into this discussion about the emphasis on STEM and technology classes versus liberal arts education, because here in the U.S. liberal arts is very common, and so what we found in doing our research and talking with who we talked to and putting the story together is that there wasn't necessarily a good system or a bad system. Here in the U.S., we do have a lot of issues, but in Quito, when we were talking to the students, a lot of times what they would say is that they wanted to become a fireman or a doctor or a lawyer to help those in their communities. And I think what that came from was, Quito's and Ecuador had a background in communism and socialism. And I think that was a reflection of the students wanting to give back to their community. So that's what we found in the education system, is that the technology and science courses were a way to give back to the community, to better their economic system. And it was just different. It wasn't different in a good way, it wasn't different in a bad way in comparison with our system, but it was good for what was like the system. So we kind of had to change our thinking and our bias toward the US system for what we came from. And I think that was a good thing that came out of this community conference.
There's actually, I just now realized that since my slides were in the wrong order, I skipped the one about reoffending rates and releasing. But I think this is really applicable, especially in our country. The reoffending rates after prison in Norway as a whole are 20%. For Australia, which I just told you about, it's 16%. And for the UK and US, depending on 3-year or 5-year, it ranges from 15 to 16%. So that's a huge difference. And it's pretty shocking to me. And I think in America, I think a lot of people haven't really even thought that there's any other way. We kind of feel like if we had all of our criminals locked up, as long as they're locked up, we're safe on the streets. But the reality is that somebody's always going to be committing a crime. We have to change our attitude to how we deal with these people who are committing crimes. Because nobody's born a criminal. Something happens to them throughout their life to make them make these choices that lead to whatever the offense is. So changing our attitude as a society and as a culture is where we need to invest our thinking and reform in American business systems, because I don't think, it's not a matter of wanting, we're just thinking about it in the wrong way. So I think that's a story in itself.
It is same to the US, because that's just a political issue. Is it a political issue in Norway, or people debate about it? Is everyone sort of like about this idea of
Yeah, it's interesting. This is not an issue in Norway. I mean, there's always people that are going to say to you, like, I think their sentence needs to be a little bit longer or something like that. Or the main issue is that the work that they're doing is not necessarily at the same pace that it's going to be in the real world. So the main issue is with just parts of their rehabilitation. But as far as this is the way we do prison, there's no debate in Norway. If you talk to a Norwegian about the fact that we have the death penalty, they just think it's crazy. I mean, and they think that 20 plus years in prison for robbing a candy store, they think that's unnecessary and crazy as well. Just the money that we're putting into holding people there without doing anything about it. I read a story or an article the other day about how there was a man who was in prison for 40 plus years, and his whole time in prison was spent learning how to be a printer. And nobody thought to tell him, when you get out of here, there's no need for printers anymore. So he literally spent his entire sentence learning how to do a job that nobody needs. And when he got out, he was shocked because he doesn't know anything about the world. They're kind of isolated. They don't know what's happening. Another lady said she was walking down the streets in New York City and she was freaked out because everyone was talking to themselves. Everybody had their iPhones and they were talking on the microphone. But she has no idea what the world looks like this day and age. People just aren't prepared. That's all I can say. They're just not prepared at all. And in Norway, they are prepared and there's no debate about it.
It sounds like that the Norwegians in that are aware of our system. And I'm wondering how aware do you think Americans are, besides you and everybody else in this
about the regions. And we may not have had time to research that yet.
I don't think many people are aware at all of the system. I know I wasn't before this project. I had no idea, and all of my friends that I've said we've got to listen to this or see what I've been researching about. They had no idea. Certainly, the generation that's going to be moving forward and making these decisions later. Certainly, I don't think we know about it, and it's just a matter of telling people, and which is why I'm trying to focus on this. There's a lot of articles about it, but it's just not portrayed in the right light. I think it's like I said before, it's portrayed as like Disney World lavish. Yeah, go to prison in Norway because it's better than when you live on the streets and other places, which is true, but there's just a lot more to it, and I don't think people know.
I have a question for both of you. Schools. In cases of universities, special education is both separate from the school. Is that like priced out to certain people? So university they only for the upper class or special ed only for
In terms of special education, like I think it's from 6 to 14. There's like a compulsory education scheme where you get 9 years of education. And so one of the problems with special education is that they're not afforded that same luxury, that same requirement that everyone else has in terms of elementary schooling, if they live in rural areas. In terms of college, yeah, there would be a socioeconomic gap because you have to pay for college, and so it would be people who are able to afford it in both special education and
In Quito and in Ecuador in general, it usually is like those who can afford it. Or I wouldn't say that the tuition is unreasonable. The public institutions and universities are generally more accessible in terms of financial, your ability to pay. Private institutions are a little bit more expensive, like similar to here in the US. However, we talked to a student, an exchange student who's at Elon University, she's from Ecuador, and she just said that she felt that the schools overall just weren't up to the caliber of the US, and that's why she decided to come to Elon, and that it wasn't very big financial to for her family to send her, but she said the opportunities that she would have far surpass what she was receiving in Quito. So it really is, a money thing. If you have the ability to go to a private institution, that's really what you want to do. But oftentimes it's especially for those kids who live in rural Ecuador and don't.
Like what the new infiltration rates are in Norway and
But yeah, in Norway as a whole, it's 20%. On bus stories, 15%. In the UK and US, it's 50 to 60%. But every country measures recidivism rates differently. Some are on a 3-year scale, some are on a 5-year scale, some are based on certain demographics. So it's really, really hard to compare them. But the comparison I got from the prison itself were those numbers: 20%, 16%, and then 50 to 60%.
I have a follow-up question, if that's all right. Hi. So this is something I struggle with a lot in journalism, is how to represent statistics when they don't come from the same source, right? And so this is a really interesting statistic, but ultimately maybe it's not comparable because perhaps they're all defined differently. What's your strategy to talk about these in your articles? But where you can avoid saying spending a paragraph talking about maybe these aren't very comparable and going into all of that,
That part was really difficult for me. I had my article written and I had the statistics not entered yet because I wasn't sure how to go about that. And I spoke with him a little bit about that because it is really difficult. It's kind of incomparable, but there's enough to show that they are drastically different. So for this, I just had to make the decision to go with the report that the Prison Island gave me. I just stuck with that because I knew it was right and I didn't trust myself to do all of the things that go with it. But you can definitely tell it's a drastic change. And I think I got that point across in my article without having to give all the details of demographics of 5 year, 3 year. I didn't focus on that because everything else that I'm saying says that in itself, I think.
I have a question for Abby. When we were talking about the elementary school considered, I was shocked when you said that the teachers actually work as volunteers, they're not paid. How are schools funded? I mean, this is mandatory education.
Normally what happens is the public schools and very select few of the private schools get funding from the government. The principal, when I was this happened, we talked to, said that after the education reforms, they did open a bunch of public and private schools. Those schools got government funding, but because they were funded, less people, less money was coming to their schools. So in turn, they had to make cuts. They can afford to pay all their teachers every day because they're not receiving as much money as they used to. And tuition for them is, I think, $15 to $20 a year, which is, nothing for us, but, for them in such a rural location, that is a lot of money, financial burden for the parents. So in order to not increase the cost, they sometimes go a month without paying for themselves. But it really is a reflection of them wanting these kids to have that opportunity to really learn and be able to excel and go on to college and continue learning higher education.
Well, we're just about out of time, so are there any more questions? Well, I want to thank all four of you and the great group presented.